The grandfather clock in our hallway, the one Richard insisted we buy on our 5th anniversary, struck midnight as I sat alone at our dining room table, staring at the divorce papers he'd left there 12 hours earlier. 40 years of marriage, and he couldn't even wait until after our anniversary dinner to tell me he was leaving. The salmon I'd spent hours preparing sat untouched in the kitchen, alongside the bottle of champagne I'd chilled for the occasion. 4 decades, together, and he ended it all with 5 cold words. "Eleanor, I want a divorce." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I ran my fingers over the elaborate letterhead of his high-priced attorney. After building our life together since we were both 22, Richard Bradley was discarding me like yesterday's newspaper. The painful irony wasn't lost on me. He'd built his financial empire with my support, my sacrifices, my ideas. Now, at 62, I was supposedly walking away with a generous settlement of our beach condo and a monthly stipend that wouldn't even cover the property taxes. It had been an ordinary Tuesday morning when everything changed. April in New England brings a special kind of light, soft and promising, filtering through the cherry blossoms outside our bedroom window. Richard and I had fallen into the comfortable routine of long-married couples. He read the financial section of the newspaper while I prepared his favorite breakfast, steel-cut oatmeal with fresh berries and a precise drizzle of honey. Just as he liked it. Just as I'd prepared it for nearly 15,000 mornings. "The Anderson account looks promising," I remarked, placing his breakfast before him. The investment firm Richard had built from nothing now managed billions in assets, and I still reviewed his major client portfolios each week, a habit from when we'd started the business from our garage apartment 4 decades ago. Richard grunted noncommittally, not looking up from his paper. His salt and pepper hair was freshly cut, his Italian suit perfectly tailored to his still athletic frame. I'd always taken pride in how distinguished my husband looked. "Perhaps we should invite the Andersons to the opera gala next month." Continued. "Their daughter just graduated from Juilliard. It would be a nice connection." "I've already invited the Crawfords," he replied, still not meeting my eyes. "Their hedge fund is considering us for management." I paused, spatula in hand. "You didn't mention that." "Didn't I?" He finally looked up, his blue eyes unreadable behind rimless glasses. Must have slipped my mind. Something in his tone made me uneasy. In recent months, Richard had been working later, traveling more frequently, and sharing less about the business decisions that we'd once discussed together over dinner every evening. I'd attributed it to the company's growth. Bradley Financial now had offices in 3 states. But standing in our gourmet kitchen that Tuesday morning, a different possibility flickered through my mind. "Is everything all right, Richard?" I asked carefully, setting down my coffee cup. He folded his newspaper precisely, aligned it with the edge of the table, a habit that had once seemed endearing, but now felt mechanical, cold. "We need to talk. Eleanor, tonight after dinner." My heart skipped. Those words, "we need to talk," rarely preceded good news, but I nodded, forcing a smile. "All right, I'm making salmon. I thought we could celebrate our anniversary a little early since you'll be in Chicago on the actual day." He checked his watch. A 60th birthday gift from me. "Fine, 7 o'clock. After he left for the office, I tried to distract myself with preparations for our dinner. I drove to the farmer's market for fresh produce, selected his favorite wine, and even bought a new dress. Emerald green, a color he'd once said brought out the gold flecks in my hazel eyes. Had that really been so long ago? By afternoon, the waiting had become unbearable. I decided to visit our daughter, Catherine, at her art gallery in downtown Greenwich. Unlike her brother Michael, who had followed Richard into finance, and now worked at a competing firm in Boston, Catherine had inherited my creative streak. Her gallery showcased emerging New England artists and had become quite successful in its 5 years of operation. The drive to her gallery usually calmed me. Winding roads past historic homes, glimpses of Long Island Sound through old growth, trees. But that day, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I mentally catalogued the possible subjects of Richard's promised talk. Health concerns, retirement plans, or something more insidious? When I arrived at the gallery, I was surprised to find it closed during normal business hours. Through the glass front, I could see Catherine in animated conversation with a well-dressed older man whose back was toward me. I was about to knock when something in their body language made me pause. Catherine looked upset, gesturing emphatically, while the man shook his head. I hesitated, then tried the door. It was unlocked. The bell chimed as I entered, and both Catherine and the man turned abruptly. To my shock, the man was Henry Blackwell, Richard's attorney and longtime friend. "Mom!" Catherine's voice held a note of alarm. "What are you doing here?" "The gallery was supposed to be open," I said, looking between them. "What's going on?" Henry recovered first, his courtroom composure slipping seamlessly into place. "Eleanor, lovely to see you. Catherine and I were just discussing a potential commission for my office." Catherine nodded too quickly. "Right, a series of local landscapes." I'd raised Catherine from infancy. I knew when she was lying. Her left eyebrow always twitched slightly. There it went. "Really? How nice," I said, playing along. Though I'm surprised Richard didn't mention Henry was looking for artwork. "It was a spur-of-the-moment idea," Henry replied smoothly. "Speaking of Richard, have you talked with him today?" "Briefly this morning. We're having an anniversary dinner tonight." I watched their reactions carefully. A look passed between them, quick but unmistakable. "That sounds lovely," Henry said, reaching for his briefcase. "I should be going. Catherine, think about what we discussed." After he left, Catherine busied herself straightening already perfectly aligned brochures on her desk. "What was that really about?" I asked directly. "Nothing important, Mom. Just business." She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Why did you stop by?" I hesitated, suddenly reluctant to voice my concerns about Richard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine adored her father. I was in the area and thought we could grab coffee. She glanced at her watch. "I'm actually expecting a client soon. Rain check?" I nodded, swallowing my disappointment. "Of course, sweetheart." As I turned to leave, Catherine called after me. "Mom?" There was something in her voice, hesitation, perhaps even pity. "You look nice today. That color suits you." It was such an odd comment, delivered with such unexpected tenderness, that it haunted me all the way home. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I prepared our anniversary dinner with mechanical precision, my mind replaying the strange encounter at Catherine's gallery. By 6 o'clock, the salmon was ready to go into the oven, the table set with our wedding china, candles waiting to be lit. I'd just slipped into my new dress when the doorbell rang. Unusual, since Richard had a key, and rarely arrived before 7. Opening the door, I found not my husband but a courier holding an envelope. "Eleanor Bradley?" he asked. "Yes." "Delivery from Blackwell Legal Services." My hands trembled slightly as I signed for the envelope. Inside were divorce papers, along with a cover letter from Henry explaining the generous settlement terms Richard was offering. The house would be sold, with Richard keeping our Manhattan apartment and the Aspen ski lodge. I would receive the beach condo in Rhode Island and a monthly maintenance payment that might have seemed substantial to an outsider, but would barely maintain the lifestyle Richard had insisted upon throughout our marriage. I was still standing, in the entryway, papers in hand, when Richard arrived home at precisely 7 o'clock. "I see the papers arrived," he said calmly. hanging his coat in the hall closet as if this were any ordinary evening. "You're divorcing me?" I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "On our anniversary?" "The timing is unfortunate," he conceded, straightening his already perfect tie. "But there's no point delaying the inevitable." I followed him into the living room in a daze. 40 years together, and you couldn't tell me yourself? You had to send Henry? I thought it would be easier this way. He poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, another anniversary gift. "Cleaner." "Cleaner?" I repeated incredulously. "There's nothing clean about dismantling a 40-year marriage. Richard, what is happening? Are you having a midlife crisis? Health problems you haven't told me about?" He took a measured sip of his scotch. "Nothing. So dramatic, Eleanor. I've simply outgrown this marriage." "Outgrown?" The word felt like a slap. "We built our lives together. The business, our children, this home." "The business is mine," he interrupted sharply. "I built Bradley Financial." For the first time that evening, genuine emotion cracked. Through his composed facade, I'd touched a nerve. "We built it together," I insisted. "I was there when you pitched your first clients at our dining table. I proofread every prospectus, entertained every potential investor." "As a good wife should," he cut in dismissively. "And you've been compensated quite well for those wifely duties. The settlement is more than fair." I stared at this stranger, wearing my husband's face. "This isn't about money." "It's always about money, Eleanor." He finished his scotch and set down the glass with finality. "I've packed what I need for now. The movers will collect the rest of my things next week." "You're leaving tonight?" The realization hit me with physical force. "Where are you going?" "I've purchased a property on Beacon Hill." He wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's better this way, making a clean break." "Purchased a property. Not rented an apartment or booked a hotel. This had been planned well in advance." "How long?" I asked quietly. "How long have you been preparing to leave me?" He checked his watch again. My gift, keeping time on the wrist of a man who'd already discarded me in his mind. "The settlement is generous, Eleanor. Don't make this difficult." "Does this have anything to do with why Henry was at Catherine's gallery today?" His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "You saw Henry today?" He and Catherine seemed quite intense, almost upset. Something flickered across Richard's face, annoyance, perhaps even concern, before his mask of indifference returned. "Whatever Henry was doing at the gallery is between him and Catherine." "And what about Michael? Does he know you're leaving his mother?" Richard straightened his cuffs, another tell of his discomfort. "Michael understands that sometimes strategic changes are necessary for optimal outcomes." I almost laughed at the corporate jargon. Strategic changes, optimal outcomes. 40 years reduced to a business transaction. "I'd like you to leave now," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. He raised an eyebrow. "This is still legally my house. And I'm still legally your wife," I countered. "At least give me tonight to process this ambush before you start exercising your legal rights." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "I'll return tomorrow to discuss logistics. The realtor will need access to the house next week." And just like that, he was gone. 40 years ended with the soft click of our front door. I stood motionless in our living room. No, not ours anymore. Surrounded by evidence of our shared life. Wedding photos on the mantel. The antique chess set we'd bought in Prague on our 25th anniversary. The slightly worn spot on his leather armchair where he'd sat reading every evening. The grandfather clock chimed 7:15. The salmon would be overcooking. The champagne over-chilling. Absurd details to fixate on while my world collapsed, yet they anchored me somehow. I mechanically went to the kitchen, turned off the oven, and poured myself a glass of the champagne intended for our celebration. Then another. By the third glass, a strange calm had settled over me. Not acceptance, but its more dangerous cousin. Resolve. I climbed the stairs to Richard's study, a room I rarely entered without invitation, a subtle boundary he'd established years ago. The door was locked, but I knew where he kept the spare key. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. Color-coded files, precisely aligned pens, a life governed by control. I sat at his desk and opened his computer. After 4 decades together, I knew all his passwords. He used variations of our children's birthdays, too sentimental or perhaps too arrogant to imagine he'd ever need stronger protection. From me, at least. What I found confirmed my emerging suspicions. Emails to realtors, dating back 6 months. Conversations with attorneys that preceded today's papers by weeks. Bank transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. But the most damning evidence came in an email chain with Bradley Financial's chief financial officer. They discussed restructuring, the company transferring assets and, most tellingly, ensuring that Eleanor Bradley remains unaware of actual holdings until after proceedings are finalized. I was still at his desk at midnight when the grandfather clock's chimes broke my concentration. 5 hours of methodical investigation had revealed the truth. Richard wasn't just leaving me, he was systematically erasing my contributions to our shared success. On paper, I would walk away with barely 10% of our actual worth. If I signed those papers, I would lose everything I'd helped build. The life I'd sacrificed for. The future I'd earned. I closed his computer and returned downstairs to where the divorce papers still lay on the dining table. 40 years of marriage, and Richard thought he could discard me with a settlement that amounted to pocket change from his perspective. He'd forgotten just one critical detail. He'd forgotten who I was before I became Mrs. Richard Bradley. Eleanor Mitchell hadn't disappeared when she took his name. She'd simply adapted, evolved, and, most importantly, learned. While Richard built his financial empire in plain sight, I had quietly created my own safety net, one careful investment at a time. I picked up my phone and sent an identical text message to both our children. Emergency family meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. at my lawyer's office, non-negotiable. Then I made one final call to a number I hadn't dialed in years. "It's Eleanor," I said when she answered, my voice steadier than it had been all day. "It's time to activate the contingency plan." On the other end of the line, my old college roommate and now one of Boston's most formidable divorce attorneys, Patricia Winters, didn't miss a beat. "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years, Ellie. It's about damn time." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the exhilarating, terrifying sensation of standing on my own 2 feet, answering to no one but myself. Richard Bradley was about to discover that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd left me with nothing, or so he thought. Until tomorrow, when I would reveal my secret accounts, carefully maintained for 35 years. Accounts that contained proof of my contributions to his business, documentation of his financial maneuverings, and enough leverage to bring Bradley financial under scrutiny from regulators who would be very interested in certain creative accounting practices I'd discovered over the years, but had loyally kept quiet about. Richard had always dismissed my financial acumen as women's intuition. He'd forgotten that before becoming his wife, I'd graduated summa cum laude in finance from the same Ivy League university where he'd barely maintained a B average. He'd forgotten that in the early years, it was my family connections that had secured his first major clients. Most critically, he'd forgotten that a woman who spends 4 decades playing the perfect corporate wife learns to observe, to anticipate, and to prepare for contingencies. I walked to the window and looked out at the manicured gardens of the estate we'd built together. Tomorrow would bring chaos, recriminations, perhaps even lasting damage to relationships I cherished. Yet alongside the grief came something unexpected. Relief. The perfectly coiffed, unfailingly supportive Mrs. Richard Bradley might be ending tonight. But Eleanor, independent, strategic, resilient Eleanor, was just beginning. Sleep evaded me that night. I paced the large master bedroom that suddenly felt like a museum of my married life rather than a sanctuary. Every corner held memories. The reading nook where I'd nursed both children through midnight fevers, the antique vanity where I'd prepared for countless charity galas and business functions, the king-sized bed where Richard and I had made love, made plans, made promises. Promises he'd apparently considered optional. By dawn, I'd settled into a strange, focused calm. I showered methodically, choosing a tailored navy suit I'd purchased for myself rather than one of the designer outfits Richard's personal shopper had selected. I swept my silver-streaked chestnut hair into a simple, elegant knot rather than booking my usual Thursday appointment at the salon, where Richard preferred I maintain the honey blonde color of my youth. I was halfway through applying my makeup when the doorbell rang. Too early for visitors, too late for Richard to have forgotten something. I wrapped my silk robe tighter and descended the grand staircase, heart thumping with an unfamiliar anxiety. Through the sidelight, I recognized my daughter's slender silhouette. Catherine's unexpected appearance at 7:30 a.m. couldn't be coincidence after yesterday's strange encounter with Henry. "Mom," she blurted as soon as I opened the door, her eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "We need to talk before this meeting." I ushered her into the kitchen, the one room in our sprawling house that had always felt truly mine. While Richard had insisted on professional designers for every other space, I'd created this sanctuary of warm copper and buttery yellow walls myself, against his preference for the sterile white kitchens featured in architectural magazines. "Coffee?" I offered, already moving toward the espresso machine, another small rebellion, purchased when Richard insisted American drip coffee was perfectly adequate. "Dad called me last night," Catherine said, perching on a bar stool at the kitchen island. "He's furious about this meeting." I measured coffee beans precisely, focusing on the familiar ritual. "I imagine he is." "Mom, what's happening? Dad says you're being unreasonable about the divorce terms, that you're threatening him somehow." The espresso machine whirred to life, its mechanical hum filling the tense silence between us. I poured 2 perfect shots, added steamed milk, and placed a cup before my daughter before answering. "Did your father mention that he served me divorce papers via courier?" "On the eve of our 40th anniversary?" Catherine winced. "He said the timing was unfortunate." "Unfortunate," I echoed, tasting the bitterness of the word along with my first sip of coffee. "And did he explain why he's been secretly planning this divorce for at least 6 months? Or why he's deliberately undervaluing our assets in the settlement offer?" My daughter's expressive eyes, so like my own, widened. 6 months? "No, he just said you'd grown apart and it was amicable." "Until you?" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Until I what, Catherine? Refused to be discarded like an outdated household appliance?" She flinched at my uncharacteristic sharpness. In 40 years of marriage, I'd cultivated a careful public persona. Eleanor Bradley, gracious corporate wife, supportive mother, tireless charity organizer, always pleasant, never confrontational. That Eleanor had served her purpose. "He said you're being vindictive," Catherine admitted quietly. "That you're threatening to damage the company out of spite." I studied my daughter over the rim of my coffee cup. At 35, Catherine had inherited my artistic sensibility and Richard's strategic mind, a powerful combination that had made her gallery successful despite Richard's initial dismissal of her hobby. But she'd also inherited my tendency to smooth over family conflicts, to prioritize harmony over honesty. "Why was Henry at your gallery yesterday?" I asked directly. Catherine's fingers tightened around her cup. "He was delivering papers." "What kind of papers?" She hesitated. "Documents transferring ownership of the gallery property." This was news. I thought you owned the building. I thought so too. Her voice cracked slightly. Turns out Dad purchased it through a holding company. He's been the landlord all along. The revelation struck me with physical force. Richard had never supported Catherine's artistic endeavors, had actively discouraged her from pursuing an art history degree, rather than following him into finance like Michael. When she'd opened the gallery 5 years ago, she'd proudly announced she'd secured a favorable lease in the competitive Greenwich market. She'd never mentioned Richard's involvement. And now, I prompted gently, the holding company is being restructured as part of Dad's. She swallowed hard. Financial reorganization. Henry came to explain that my rent will triple next quarter to reflect market rates. The calculated cruelty took my breath away. Richard wasn't just leaving me. He was systematically securing control over our children's loyalty. Michael already worked for a firm financially entangled with Bradley Investments. Now Catherine's gallery, her passion, her independence, was revealed as another tendril of Richard's influence. I see, I said, my resolve hardening further. And this is the man who claims I'm being vindictive. Catherine looked miserable. What choice do I have, Mom? I can't afford triple rent. Most of the gallery's profits go back into supporting new artists. You always have choices, I said, reaching across the island to cover her hand with mine. More than you realize. Is that what this meeting is about? Your choices. I smiled for the first time since Richard had walked out. In a manner of speaking, now finish your coffee and help me choose appropriate jewelry for confronting a duplicitous husband. Catherine followed me upstairs, her confusion evident, but questions temporarily suspended. In my dressing room, I bypassed the wall of designer accessories Richard had gifted me over the years, each piece selected with an eye toward displaying his success rather than complimenting my taste. Instead, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my jewelry case and removed a worn leather pouch. I've never seen those before, Catherine remarked as I fastened simple pearl studs surrounded by small, perfect diamonds. They were my grandmother's, I explained, adding the matching bracelet. She left them to me with strict instructions never to sell them, no matter how difficult life became. They're beautiful, Catherine said, but not exactly your usual style. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. The elegant woman looking back at me seemed both familiar and foreign, like meeting a childhood friend after decades apart. No, I agreed. They're not Mrs. Richard Bradley's style, but they're very much Eleanor Mitchell's. Catherine's brow furrowed. Mom, you're talking strangely. You're scaring me a little. I turned to face my daughter fully. Catherine, have you ever wondered what I did before I met your father? She shrugged slightly. You were in college. That's where you met. I was studying finance, I said carefully. On a full academic scholarship. I graduated top of my class with job offers from 3 Wall Street firms. Catherine stared at me. But you never worked in finance. Didn't I? I smiled enigmatically. Your father and I graduated the same year. He had an idea for a boutique investment firm. I had family connections through my father's banking business and a trust fund from my grandmother. We decided to build something together. Dad never mentioned that. No, he wouldn't have. I checked my watch, a simple, elegant timepiece I'd purchased myself, not the diamond-encrusted showpiece Richard had given me for our 35th anniversary. We should leave soon. Patricia doesn't tolerate tardiness. Who's Patricia? My attorney. I gathered my purse and a slim leather portfolio, and an old friend who's been waiting a very long time for today. The drive to Boston passed in relative silence, Catherine respecting my need to prepare, mentally for the confrontation ahead. When we arrived at the sleek downtown office building housing Winters and Associates, Michael was already waiting in the lobby, his expression a mixture of irritation and confusion. This better be important, he greeted us, checking his Rolex, identical to the one Richard wore. I had to reschedule 2 client meetings. Trust me, I replied, stepping into the elevator. You wouldn't want to miss this. Patricia Winters had established her reputation demolishing the carefully constructed financial fabrications of wealthy men attempting to cheat their wives in divorce proceedings. Her corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, the spectacular view a testament to her success in a male-dominated field. She rose from behind her imposing desk as we entered, her tall frame still yoga flexible at 63, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that meant business. "Eleanor?" she greeted me warmly, embracing me with genuine affection before turning to my children. "You must be Catherine and Michael. Your mother has spoken of you often." "You've never mentioned Patricia before," Michael said to me, his tone accusatory. "There are many things your mother hasn't mentioned," Patricia replied for me, gesturing toward the conference table where 4 leather portfolios were precisely arranged. "Please, be seated. We're expecting one more person." "Father won't be coming," Michael said stiffly. "He made that quite clear when he called me this morning." Patricia checked her watch and smiled. 3, 2, 1. The door opened, and Henry Blackwell entered, his courtroom confidence momentarily faltering at the sight of our assembled group. "Henry," Patricia greeted him with professional courtesy. "Right on time. Richard couldn't make it?" Henry's eyes darted to me. "Mr. Bradley sends his regrets. As his attorney, I'm fully authorized to witness the most significant financial miscalculation of his career?" Patricia interrupted pleasantly. "Excellent. Please join us." Henry hesitated, clearly reconsidering his presence before taking the remaining seat. "Mrs. Bradley, while I understand you're upset about the divorce—" "Actually," I cut in, "I'm not upset about the divorce itself. I'm upset about the systematic financial deception my husband has engaged in for approximately 15 years with your assistance." Henry's expression didn't change, but a slight tightening around his eyes confirmed my suspicion. "That's a serious allegation." "Indeed," I agreed, opening my portfolio. "One supported by extensive documentation." Patricia took over smoothly. "Before Mrs. Bradley presents her evidence, I'd like to establish some basic facts for Catherine and Michael's benefit." She turned to my children. "Your mother and father founded Bradley Financial together in 1983, using seed capital primarily from your mother's trust fund. Is that your understanding?" Michael frowned. "Dad built the company from nothing." "That's the mythology," Patricia acknowledged. "The reality is more complex." She slid documents across the table. "These are the original incorporation papers. Note that Eleanor Mitchell Bradley is listed as co-founder and chief financial officer." "That can't be right," Michael muttered, scanning the yellow documents. "Dad always said Mom was the supportive wife who handled the social aspects." "Another convenient mythology," Patricia continued. "For the first 12 years of Bradley Financial's existence, your mother managed the firm's accounting, compliance, and internal operations, while your father handled client acquisition and investment strategy. Their complementary skills were the foundation of the company's early success." Catherine looked up from the documents. "If that's true, why isn't Mom still involved in the business?" I answered this time. "Because when you were born, Michael, the company was growing rapidly. Your father argued that one of us needed to focus on family matters. Since his client-facing role was more visible, we agreed that I would step back from daily operations." "Step back, perhaps," Patricia interjected, "but never completely away." Eleanor continued to review major investment strategies, maintain key client relationships, and provide critical input on significant business decisions, all while managing your household, supporting your father's career, and raising 2 children. Henry cleared his throat. "This historical perspective is fascinating but irrelevant to the current divorce proceedings. Mr. Bradley has offered a generous settlement reflecting the traditional domestic contributions of Mrs. Bradley." Patricia's smile turned predatory. Traditional domestic contributions, how charmingly dismissive. She nodded to me. Eleanor, perhaps it's time to show them what traditional looks like. I opened my slim portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper, sliding it across to Henry. This is a current account statement from a trust established in my name in 1990. Henry glanced at it dismissively, then did a double take, his professional composure finally cracking. This is a fabrication. It's quite real, I assured him. The Mitchell Family Trust has been actively managed for over 30 years. My grandmother was very clear about maintaining financial independence, even within marriage. Michael leaned over to look at the statement, his eyes widening. Mom, this says you have over $12 million. 14.6 actually, as of this morning's market opening, I corrected gently. A small portion of my grandmother's inheritance, invested carefully over time. And that's just the beginning, Patricia added, distributing thicker folders to everyone at the table. Please review the contents carefully. You'll find documentation of Eleanor's financial activities over the past 40 years. Catherine opened her folder first, leafing through the pages with growing astonishment. Mom, these are records of investments in over 24 startup companies, art acquisitions, real estate holdings. All managed through separate accounts and legal entities, I confirmed. Most performing quite well. Michael was scanning his documents more rapidly, his financial training allowing him to quickly grasp the implications. These portfolio values. The diversity of assets. Mom, your worth. Approximately $87 million, Patricia supplied helpfully. Independently of Bradley Financial or any marital assets. Henry's face had gone pale. These accounts aren't listed in any of the financial disclosures for the divorce proceedings. No, I agreed. Just as Richard's Cayman Islands accounts, the Swiss holdings, and the Singapore Investment Trust aren't listed in his disclosures. The room went silent. Henry's expression confirmed what I'd suspected. Richard had hidden substantial assets, even from his own attorney. Would you like to see those records as well? I asked pleasantly. I've maintained quite thorough documentation of my husband's financial creativity. Henry cleared his throat. Any allegations regarding undisclosed assets would need substantial proof. Like the proof I provided to the SEC this morning? I interrupted. Or the documentation I've shared with the IRS regarding certain tax positions Bradley Financial has taken over the past decade? You wouldn't, Henry whispered. That would destroy the company. Your children's inheritance would be secure regardless, I finished for him. As the documentation shows, I've spent 40 years building a safety net for my family that doesn't depend on Richard's financial manipulations. Michael slammed his folder shut. This is insane. Dad would never hide assets or evade taxes. He's meticulous about compliance. I regarded my son with sympathy. He'd idolized Richard all his life, following his father's path without questioning. The shortcuts and ethical compromises along the way. Your father is indeed meticulous, I agreed. Particularly about maintaining separate record systems. The compliance documentation clients and regulators see is impeccable. The internal tracking of actual fund allocations and profit distributions is considerably less orthodox. Catherine had been silent, continuing to review the documents with growing comprehension. The gallery building, she said suddenly. You knew Dad owned it? I nodded. I knew every property held by Bradley Financial and its subsidiaries, just as I knew about the plan to triple your rent if you sided with me in the divorce. There was no plan to, Henry began, but Catherine cut him off. Yes, there was. You told me so yourself yesterday, Henry. She turned to me. But if you knew, why didn't you warn me? Because I needed to understand where everyone stood. I said quietly, including you, Catherine. The hurt in her eyes was painful to witness. You were testing me? I was giving you the opportunity to make choices with full information, I corrected gently, something your father never allowed any of us. Patricia intervened smoothly. The key point here is that Eleanor has maintained detailed records of both her own financial activities and Richard's more questionable maneuvers for decades. She's prepared to use this information to ensure a fair divorce settlement. Blackmail, you mean? Henry muttered. Patricia's smile was glacial. Let's call it leverage. Eleanor isn't interested in destroying Bradley Financial or damaging her children's future. She simply wants recognition of her contributions and a fair division of genuine marital assets. Michael was shaking his head. I don't understand. If you had all this money, all these investments of your own, why stay with Dad? Why play the corporate wife for 40 years? It was the question I'd asked myself repeatedly during last night's sleepless hours. The answer surprised even me with its simplicity. Because I loved him, I said. I believed in our partnership, our family, our shared vision. I never saw my separate financial activities as preparation for divorce. They were insurance against exactly this kind of situation, one partner making unilateral decisions that affected everyone. Catherine reached for my hand across the table. All those charity committees, the endless social obligations, the perfect hostess routine. Was any of it real? All of it was real, I assured her. I took pride in supporting your father's business through social connections. I genuinely enjoyed many of those activities. I simply maintained other interests as well. Interests your father dismissed as frivolous hobbies. Such as? Michael challenged. My art collection, which Catherine has been unknowingly helping me build through her gallery. My venture capital investments in women-led tech companies. My silent partnership in 3 Broadway productions. I smiled at their astonished expressions. Did you never wonder why we attended so many theater openings? Henry had been reviewing the documentation with growing alarm. Mrs. Bradley, what exactly are you proposing here? I'm proposing we renegotiate the divorce settlement to reflect reality rather than your client's convenient fiction, I replied. Patricia has prepared an alternative agreement that acknowledges my co-founding role in Bradley Financial and provides for a fair division of all marital assets, including those currently held offshore. And if Mr. Bradley refuses? Patricia answered, then Mrs. Bradley will have no choice but to provide her documentation to relevant regulatory authorities. I imagine the SEC would be particularly interested in the discrepancies between Bradley Financial's public filings and its actual activities. The implied threat hung in the air between us. Henry exhaled slowly. I'll need to consult with my client. Of course, Patricia agreed pleasantly. You have 24 hours. As Henry gathered his papers to leave, I added, one more thing. The new agreement will need to include complete autonomy for Catherine's gallery, with ownership of the building transferred to her outright. And Michael's employment contract with Eastridge Capital needs to be guaranteed for at least 5 years, regardless of any changes in his relationship with Bradley Financial. Henry's eyebrows rose. You're securing your children's professional independence from their father? I'm securing their ability to make choices without financial coercion, I corrected, a distinction Richard has never appreciated. After Henry departed, the room fell silent. Patricia excused herself tactfully, leaving me alone with my children, for the inevitable reckoning. Michael spoke first, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. Why didn't you tell us any of this before? About your role in the company, about Dad's methods. Would you have believed me? I asked gently. You've idolized your father since childhood, Michael. You built your entire career modeling his approach to finance. So instead, you let me believe the myth? That he was some self-made financial genius and you were just along for the ride? I let you form your own relationship with your father without my interference, I countered. just as I let Catherine pursue her passion for art despite his dismissal. Catherine had been uncharacteristically quiet, still processing the revelations. "All these years," she finally said, "I thought I was defying Dad by choosing art over finance, but you were secretly supporting me, weren't you? Those anonymous purchases at the gallery. The mysterious collector who always seemed to buy the most experimental pieces." I smiled. The Mitchell collection has quite a reputation in certain circles. "You were my biggest client," she realized, "and I never knew. I believed in your eye, your instincts, but I didn't want my support to overshadow your own accomplishments." Michael stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us as he stared out at Boston Harbor. "Dad called me this morning," he said without turning. "He said you'd had some kind of breakdown after he asked for a divorce, that you were threatening to destroy everything he'd built out of vindictiveness." "And what do you think now?" I asked quietly. He turned, his expression conflicted. "I think I don't know either of my parents as well as I thought I did." It was a fair assessment, if painful to hear. "For what it's worth," I offered, "I believe your father genuinely doesn't see what he's done as wrong. In his mind, he built Bradley Financial through his own genius. My contributions, like those of many others along the way, have been minimized or forgotten in the narrative he's created. That doesn't excuse lying about assets in a divorce," Catherine pointed out, "or whatever tax issues you've documented." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't. But understanding Richard's perspective helps explain why he thought this deception would succeed. He truly doesn't believe I'm capable of comprehending, let alone challenging, his financial maneuvers." Michael returned to the table, his analytical mind clearly processing the implications. "What happens now? To the company? To Dad?" "That depends largely on your father's response to the new settlement proposal," I said. "If he agrees to a fair division of assets and acknowledges my role as co-founder, Bradley Financial can continue operating with minimal disruption." "And if he doesn't?" Catherine pressed. I met my daughter's gaze steadily. "Then I'll be forced to use the leverage I've spent decades accumulating. Not out of vengeance, but because I refuse to be erased from my own life story." The weight of this statement settled over the room. For the first time, my children were seeing me not just as their mother or Richard's wife, but as an individual with my own ambitions, capabilities, and boundaries. "You've been playing a very long game," Michael finally said, a reluctant admiration in his voice. "I've been protecting myself and my family," I corrected. "There's a difference." Catherine reached for my hand again. "What do you need from us, Mom?" The question touched me deeply. For decades, I'd been the one asking that of others. What do you need? How can I help? What can I do? Having it directed toward me felt both foreign and affirming. "I need you. Both to make your own informed choices," I said. "About your relationship with your father, with the company, with me. I've given you the facts as I know them. What you do with that information is entirely up to you." Michael frowned. "You're not asking us to choose sides. I'm asking you to choose truth," I replied. "Whatever that means for each of you." As we prepared to leave Patricia's office, Catherine hesitated. "Mom, where will you go now? Back to the house?" Shook my head. "I've already arranged for movers to pack my personal belongings. I own a penthouse apartment overlooking the public garden. I purchased it 5 years ago when your father first mentioned retirement." "You've had a secret apartment for 5 years?" Michael's tone was incredulous. "Not secret," I corrected. "Strategic. I've been preparing for this transition since your father started mentioning how much he was looking forward to freedom after stepping down from Bradley Financial." "You knew he was planning to leave you?" Catherine asked. "I suspected he was contemplating a significant life change," I said carefully. "Whether that included divorcing me or simply shifting our relationship dynamic, I wanted to be prepared." As we rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication at finally revealing my carefully constructed safety net, sadness for the end of a 40-year partnership, anxiety about Richard's potential, reaction, but above all, a profound sense of liberation. The carefully maintained facade of Eleanor Bradley, perfect corporate wife, had served its purpose. Now, at 62, I was stepping fully into the identity I'd been quietly nurturing all along. Eleanor Mitchell, financial strategist, art collector, Broadway investor, and woman of independent means. I still can't believe you've been living this double life all these years, Michael said as we reached our cars. It's like finding out your mild-mannered mother is secretly a ninja. I laughed, a genuine, unreserved sound that surprised even me. Not a ninja, just a woman who remembered her grandmother's most important lesson. Always keep something that's just yours. As I drove away from Boston toward the new life awaiting me, I glanced in my rearview mirror. My children stood watching, their expressions still bewildered but with the first glimmers of a new understanding. They were seeing me clearly perhaps for the first time, not as an appendage to their father, but as a woman in my own right. Richard had left me with nothing, or so he thought. He'd soon discover just how catastrophically he had underestimated the woman who had stood beside him for 40 years. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, negotiation, perhaps even reconciliation, of a sort. But today belonged to Eleanor Mitchell, emerging from the shadows at last. The penthouse overlooking Boston Public Garden reflected nothing of the turmoil in my life. I'd furnished it over the years with treasures Richard had dismissed as impractical. The hand-painted Japanese screen I'd discovered in Kyoto, the modernist leather chairs from a small Danish workshop, the abstract expressionist paintings by women artists whose careers I'd quietly supported. Every piece represented a choice made solely for myself, not to impress clients or reflect the Bradley family image. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows as twilight descended over Boston, watching office lights flicker on across the cityscape. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since I left Patricia's office. Richard, finally realizing the gravity of his miscalculation. I'd let his calls go to voicemail. Whatever blustering threats or sudden concessions he might offer deserved a proper audience, not a hasty exchange while I was still processing the day's emotional revelations. Instead, I poured myself a glass of the Chateau Margaux I'd purchased and cellared without Richard's knowledge. One of dozens of small rebellions against his preference for showy California Cabernets that impressed business associates with their price tags rather than their subtlety. The doorbell rang precisely at 8. Richard had always prided himself on punctuality, a virtue he'd elevated to near religious significance in our household. I took a deliberate moment to finish my wine before answering. He stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed as always, though a careful observer might notice the slight disarray of his normally perfect silver hair, the faint shadows beneath his eyes. His expression cycled rapidly through shock, anger, and calculation as he took in my appearance and the apartment behind me. "How long have you had this place?" he demanded without preamble. "Good evening to you too, Richard." I stepped aside. "Please come in. I believe we have much to discuss." He entered warily, like a predator sensing a trap. His gaze swept over the spacious living area, cataloging items, undoubtedly calculating their value. When his eyes landed on a particular painting, a vibrant Cecily Brown canvas acquired at auction 3 years ago, his jaw tightened. "That's a Brown. Must have cost $1.8 million, I supplied calmly. "A sound investment. Her work has appreciated 30% since then." Richard turned to face me fully, reassessing me with narrowed eyes. "Who are you?" The question wasn't entirely rhetorical. "Someone you've lived with for 40 years but apparently never truly seen." I gestured toward the sitting area. "Would you care for a drink? We both might need one for this conversation." He declined with a curt shake of his head. Henry called. Said you've made some outrageous claims about hidden assets, threatened regulatory action. His tone was dismissive, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. Not claims, Richard. Facts. I seated myself in one of the Danish chairs, leaving him standing. A small power play he wouldn't miss. Facts meticulously documented over 15 years of watching you systematically restructure Bradley Financial to minimize my potential claim in the event of divorce. That's absurd. The company restructuring was for tax efficiency and to create a labyrinth of subsidiaries, holding companies, and offshore entities that would make it nearly impossible to determine the firm's actual value? I smiled thinly. A brilliant strategy. It might have worked on someone else. Richard paced the room, his customary composure fracturing. Henry says you've been running some kind of parallel financial operation for decades. Secret accounts. An art collection. Property. He gestured around the penthouse. Obviously, this. Not secret, I corrected. Private. There's a distinction. Private from your husband of 40 years? Private from a man who consistently dismissed my financial acumen as feminine intuition, while simultaneously relying on it to build his empire. I kept my voice level. A man who told our son that he built the company from nothing, when he knows perfectly well that my trust fund provided the seed capital and my family connections secured the first major clients. Richard's expression darkened. You've turned the children against me. I've simply provided them with facts you deliberately withheld. Their judgments are their own. He finally sat down across from me, leaning forward with the intense focus he typically reserved for recalcitrant clients. What do you want, Eleanor? Money? Public acknowledgement? Revenge? Justice, I replied simply. Recognition of my contributions. A fair division of our actual assets, not the artificially diminished pool you've presented in your settlement offer. And if I refuse? Then the SEC, the IRS, and several international regulatory bodies will receive comprehensive documentation of Bradley Financial's more creative accounting practices. I met his gaze steadily. Your choice. Richard's laugh held no humor. You're bluffing. You wouldn't destroy the company. It would devastate the children's inheritance. Our children are already protected, I replied. Catherine will own her gallery building outright. Michael's position at Eastridge is secured regardless of any fallout. And both have trusts established through my private holdings that you cannot touch. The revelation visibly startled him. You've been planning this for years. I've been protecting myself and our children from your unilateral decisions for years, I corrected. There's a difference. Richard stood again, unable to contain his agitation. This isn't you, Eleanor. This calculating, vindictive person. This isn't the woman I married. Perhaps not, I acknowledged. But it is the woman who stayed married to you for 40 years, while you gradually erased her contributions, dismissed her intelligence, and planned your exit strategy without the courtesy of a conversation. A heavy silence fell between us. 4 decades of shared history suddenly reframed by revelations neither of us could retreat from. Finally, Richard sighed and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. I underestimated you. The admission seemed to cost him physically. You did, I agreed, consistently and comprehensively. He turned back to me, his expression difficult to read. Was any of it real? Our marriage? Our partnership? The question pierced deeper than I'd expected, cutting through the righteous indignation I'd been maintaining. All of it was real, Richard, including the parts you chose not to see. And now? Now we negotiate a divorce settlement that reflects reality rather than convenience. Patricia has prepared documents acknowledging my co-founding role in Bradley, financial and providing for equitable division of all assets, including those currently held in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. His eyebrows rose slightly. You know about Singapore? I know everything, Richard. Every account, every transaction, every questionable tax position. I've been the silent partner in our financial dance for 40 years, watching, learning, documenting. He ran a hand through his silver hair, a rare gesture of discomposure. You could have confronted me years ago. Why wait until now? Because I believed in our marriage, I said simply. I believed your financial maneuvering was about wealth preservation for our family, not preparation for abandoning it. Richard flinched at the word, abandoning, the first real emotion he'd shown beyond anger and calculation. He moved toward the drinks cabinet. I think I'll have that drink now? I nodded, watching as he poured himself a generous measure of scotch, not the brand he preferred, I noted with private satisfaction, but one I'd selected for my own taste. You've always been remarkable, Eleanor, he said after taking a long swallow. I built my reputation on anticipating market movements, predicting human behavior. How did I miss this? You saw what you expected to see, I replied. The dutiful wife, the supportive partner, the woman who set aside her own ambitions to facilitate yours. It never occurred to you that I might be capable of parallel tracks, fulfilling those roles while simultaneously building something of my own. Like a sleeper agent, he murmured, almost to himself. No, Richard. Like a woman who remembered her grandmother's most important lesson. Always keep something that's just yours. He finished his drink in silence, then placed the crystal tumbler down with deliberate care. I'll review the proposed settlement with Henry tomorrow. 24 hours, Richard. After that, the regulatory option becomes active. His eyes hardened at the reminder. You realize this approach ensures we can never reconcile? The question caught me off guard. Reconciliation was never on the table. You made that clear when you served me divorce papers on the eve of our anniversary. Perhaps I was precipitous. He straightened his already perfect tie. 40? Years is a long time to simply discard, Eleanor. We built something extraordinary together. I studied him carefully, noting the calculation behind the sentiment. Are you suggesting you've changed your mind about the divorce? I'm suggesting we consider all options before dismantling a lifetime of partnership. His tone shifted to the one he used for particularly delicate negotiations. Bradley Financial is still a family company at heart. Our professional and personal legacies are intertwined. I almost laughed at the transparent strategy. Richard wasn't reconsidering our marriage. He was attempting to protect his company and reputation. The time for that conversation was before you rented a moving truck, Richard. Now we focus on equitable dissolution. His expression hardened. And if equity isn't possible without destroying what we've built, then you should have considered that before serving divorce papers to a woman you grievously underestimated. After Richard left, I waited for the emotional collapse that seemed inevitable after such a confrontation. Instead, I felt a curious lightness, as if decades of performing a role had finally been shed, leaving me unencumbered, authentically myself for the first time since we'd exchanged vows at 22. I slept deeply that night in my own bed, in my own space, surrounded by possessions chosen solely for my pleasure, rather than their ability to project success or conform to Richard's aesthetic. When morning came, I approached it with a deliberation that had nothing to do with maintaining the careful schedule of Mrs. Richard Bradley and everything to do with honoring Eleanor Mitchell's natural rhythms. Catherine called while I was enjoying a leisurely second cup of coffee on my terrace overlooking the garden. Dad showed up at my apartment last night, she began without preamble. He was different, rattled. I imagine he was, I replied, watching a pair of cardinals flit between budding tree branches below. He offered to gift me the gallery building outright. No strings attached. Her voice held equal parts wonder and suspicion. He's never supported my art career before. He's attempting to secure your loyalty in the divorce, I said matter-of-factly. It's a calculated move, but the outcome benefits you regardless. Accept the gift, Catherine. Just understand the motivation behind it. She was quiet for a moment. He asked a lot of questions about you. Your apartment, your investments. He seemed genuinely shocked that you'd built this separate life alongside your marriage. Your father has always seen what he expects to see, I replied. It never occurred to him that I might be more than the role he assigned me. It never occurred to me either, Catherine admitted softly. I'm sorry for that, Mom. The apology touched me. You were raised in a household where your father's perspective dominated. It's understandable that you absorbed his view of me. Still, I should have looked deeper. Her voice strengthened with resolve. I'm having brunch with Michael later. He's still processing everything, but I think he's coming around. Dad called him too last night. With a similar offer of professional security, I imagine? Apparently. Michael wouldn't give details, but he said Dad was uncharacteristically generous. I smiled to myself. Richard was following the playbook I'd anticipated, attempting to secure our children's allegiance through financial incentives while he calculated his response to my settlement proposal. Just remember, whatever your father offers was already included in the settlement I proposed, I said. I made sure both of you would be protected regardless of his reaction. I know that now, Catherine replied. That's what I find most amazing in all this. You've been 3 steps ahead of everyone for years, protecting us while we had no idea we needed protection. After we hung up, I spent the morning visiting my favorite small gallery in the South, and then lunched alone at a waterfront restaurant where I was known as Ms. Mitchell, not Mrs. Bradley. The freedom to move through the world as myself rather than as Richard's appendage felt both novel and deeply familiar, like returning to a homeland after decades in exile. Patricia called just as I was finishing my tea. Richard's attorney reached out, she said without preamble. They'd like to meet tomorrow to discuss settlement terms. And the regulatory threat? Henry made some noise about coercion, but I reminded him that voluntary disclosure of financial irregularities looks much better than forced disclosure after investigation. Richard won't surrender easily, I cautioned. He'll have counter-proposals, conditions. Of course he will. Patricia agreed. But he's lost his primary advantage, the element of surprise. He thought he was dealing with a decorative corporate wife. Instead, he's facing a financial strategist who's documented his every move for 15 years. The meeting was scheduled for noon the following day at Patricia's office, neutral territory that nonetheless gave us the psychological advantage. I dressed with deliberate care in a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority without flashiness, accessorized only with my grandmother's pearls and the slim platinum watch I'd purchased to celebrate my first $1 million in independent investments. Richard arrived flanked by Henry and Bradley Financial's chief financial officer, Martin Wells, a man who had always treated me with barely concealed condescension at company functions. Their power play of bringing additional firepower was so predictable, I almost smiled. Patricia, equal to the challenge, had arranged for her firm's top forensic accountant to join us, Sophia Mendez, whose reputation for dismantling complex financial deceptions had earned her the nickname the Bloodhound in legal circles. Richard looked momentarily disconcerted at Sophia's presence, confirmation that he'd planned to overwhelm us with financial technicalities. Instead, he was facing 2 women whose combined expertise equaled or exceeded his team's. Shall we begin? Patricia suggested pleasantly, distributing folders containing our revised settlement proposal. What followed was 4 hours of intense negotiation, with Richard fighting for every percentage point, every asset, every concession. He objected vehemently to acknowledging my co-founding role in Bradley Financial, a sticking point I had anticipated. Bradley Financial has traded On Richard's name and reputation for almost 4 decades, Henry argued. Retroactively inserting Mrs. Bradley as co-founder would create market confusion and potentially shareholder concern. Eleanor's name is already on the original incorporation documents, Patricia countered smoothly. We're not inserting anything, merely acknowledging historical fact. Historical fact that was deliberately obscured, I added, meeting Richard's gaze directly. By whom or why isn't relevant now. What matters is correcting the record before I consider any settlement terms. Richard leaned forward. You'd jeopardize the company's stability for pride? For truth, I corrected. And the company's stability was jeopardized the moment you decided to rewrite its origin story to exclude me. The battle continued through each major asset. The Manhattan apartment, which Richard insisted was essential for client entertaining, the Aspen property, which he claimed was primarily an investment vehicle, the art collection in our Greenwich home, which he suddenly declared had deep sentimental value, despite having previously dismissed most pieces as decorative nonsense. Through it all, I maintained a calm certainty that unnerved him visibly. The woman across the negotiating table wasn't the accommodating wife he'd expected to acquiesce to his terms. She was a formidable opponent who had anticipated his every move and prepared countermeasures years in advance. By late afternoon, exhaustion began to show on all faces except Patricia's and mine. We had prepared for this marathon. Richard and his team had expected capitulation within the first hour. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow, Henry suggested, rubbing his temples. That won't be necessary, I replied. My terms are clear and non-negotiable on the key points: acknowledgement of my co-founding role, equitable division of all assets, including those held offshore, and financial security for Catherine and Michael independent of their relationship with either of us. Richard studied me with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. You've become quite the negotiator, Eleanor. I've always been a negotiator, Richard. You simply weren't paying attention. A moment of recognition passed between us, perhaps the most honest exchange we'd had in years. For the first time, he was seeing me clearly, without the distorting lens of his own assumptions. I need to consult privately with my team, he finally said. Patricia gestured toward a smaller conference room. Take all the time you need. We'll be here. When they had gone, she turned to me with a raised eyebrow. He's looking for a way to salvage his ego while giving you substantially everything you've asked for. I know, I replied. Richard has always needed to believe he's winning, even when he's compromising. Are you prepared to give him that illusion if it secures the substantive terms? I considered the question carefully. Yes, within reason. This isn't about humiliating Richard. It's about ensuring the truth is acknowledged and my future is secure. 20 minutes later, Richard and his team returned. Henry presented their counter-proposal, acknowledgement of my significant early contributions to Bradley Financial with a special founder's recognition at the company's upcoming 40th anniversary, division of assets that included the Manhattan apartment remaining with Richard but the Aspen property transferring to me, and a financial settlement reflecting approximately 45% of the company's true value rather than the 10% initially offered. And the offshore accounts? Patricia prompted. Will be disclosed in full as part of the final settlement, Henry conceded reluctantly. I exchanged a glance with Patricia, who gave a subtle nod. The terms weren't perfect, but they represented a dramatic improvement over Richard's initial offer and acknowledged the fundamentals of my contribution. I find these terms generally acceptable, I said, with 2 modifications. First, the founders. Recognition will specify co-founder clearly and prominently in all materials. Second, the financial settlement will include provisions for annual review of Bradley Financial's performance with appropriate adjustments to ensure my share remains proportional to actual company value. Richard's jaw tightened at the second condition. a safeguard against future financial manipulation. But after a momentary standoff, he nodded. Agreed. As the attorneys finalized the framework for our settlement, Richard and I found ourselves momentarily alone near the window, overlooking Boston Harbor. "You could have destroyed me," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" "Because destruction was never my goal," I replied. "Justice was." He studied me with new eyes. "All these years I thought I knew you." "You knew the parts of me you found. Useful or decorative," I corrected gently. "You never looked deeper." "And now?" "Now it's too late for our marriage, but perhaps not too late for mutual respect." Richard nodded slowly. "I underestimated you, Eleanor. I won't make that mistake again." "No," I agreed. "You won't." When the meeting finally concluded, I felt a profound sense of completion rather than triumph. The path to this moment had been long and often painful, but the outcome, recognition, security, independence, justified every careful step. As I left Patricia's office, Catherine was waiting in the lobby, her expression a mixture of anxiety and hope. "It's done," I told her, embracing her warmly. "The terms are fair, your gallery is secure, and your father has agreed to acknowledge the truth about Bradley Financial's founding." "Does that mean you and Dad might—" "No, sweetheart." I cut off the hopeful question gently but firmly. "The marriage is over, but our family isn't. It's just reconfiguring." We walked together toward the waterfront, the spring air carrying the first real warmth of the season. Catherine linked her arm through mine, a gesture of solidarity she hadn't offered since adolescence. "I keep thinking about all those charity events, corporate functions, holiday parties," she said thoughtfully. "How you always made everything look effortless. The perfect corporate wife, the consummate hostess." "Image management was part of building Bradley Financial," I acknowledged. "Your father handled external business strategy. I managed the social infrastructure that supported it. But all the while, you were building your own empire in secret." "Not secret," I corrected again. "Private. And not an empire. A safety net. For myself, for you and Michael." Catherine stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "How did you know that you'd need it eventually?" The question deserved a thoughtful answer. "I didn't know specifically, but my grandmother lived through the Depression after losing everything when my grandfather died unexpectedly. She raised my mother alone, building financial independence from nothing. Her most important lesson to me was that security comes from what you control completely." "So it wasn't that you didn't trust Dad?" "It was that I trusted myself more," I clarified. And as it turns out, that trust was well placed. As we continued our walk, I felt the weight of Eleanor Bradley, the carefully constructed persona I'd maintained for 4 decades, finally lifting completely. In her place stood Eleanor Mitchell, financial strategist, art collector, mother, and woman of independent means. Richard had left me with nothing, or so he'd thought. Instead, he'd inadvertently liberated me to claim everything that had always been mine, my history, my accomplishments, my future. That evening, alone in my penthouse overlooking the public garden, I opened the small, leather-bound journal I'd maintained since our wedding day. In it, I'd recorded not the expected sentimental milestones of marriage, but the careful accounting of my separate financial activities. Every investment, every acquisition, every strategic decision made with an eye toward eventual independence. On the final page, I wrote simply, "Settlement reached. Terms acceptable. EM fully restored." Those last 2 words, "fully restored," captured the essence of my journey. Not just the restoration of financial equity or professional recognition, but the reclamation of my complete self after decades of strategic compromise. I closed the journal and placed it on my bookshelf between volumes on art history and financial strategy, no longer needing to hide it among Richard's unread business biographies. Then I poured a glass of my favorite champagne and raised it, in a silent toast to my grandmother, whose wisdom had guided me even from beyond the grave. Always keep something that's just yours, she had counseled. I had kept not just something, but everything essential. My intelligence, my determination, my capacity for strategic patience. And now, at 62, I was beginning again, not as half of a partnership, but as the architect of my own life. Richard had left me with nothing until I revealed my secret accounts, not just of money, but of strength, resilience, and self-worth, that had been accumulating interest all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.